How's everybody doing? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down, thumbs up. I like that, Angela. Way back there, we got like a really high thumbs up. There's a little girl back there, all thumbs. She's so cute. All right. Hey, my name's Bill, one of the pastors here at the Bridge. Just want to say, so glad you're here with us. Just excited about what we're doing. Today is a really special day for our church as we will be having some baptisms kind of after everything. So really cool. So, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you got invited and you're like, oh, my friends like trapped me here. Like now I'm stuck listening to this bald guy that I really don't want to listen to for 30 minutes. I guarantee you, you'll be okay. And we'll take good care of you. Hopefully you won't get too scared. But we're glad that you're here and excited just about what God's doing in our midst. So, hey, last week, if you were here, we talked about kind of this idea of, hey, if we just allow God to use us, and let's just see what happens next week, right? And so I said that last week, and I hope some of you took me up on that challenge, and you went and began to pray and say, God, just use me. Put me in situations this week where you can use me. And so I want to share with you kind of some crazy things that happened to me this week before I jump into what we're going to talk about, because maybe it's some encouragement to you to really step out and say, okay, God, when we ask God and we put ourselves at His feet and say, use us, He'll do it. He will if we're available to Him. And so really like 10 or 15 things happened to me this week. And so I'm going to kind of share with you kind of the top 5 things, kind of like in sequence, kind of these different little stories that happened. So one story that happened real quick was out of nowhere, I received this message from a friend of mine. He was actually in my youth ministry, and then he actually became one of my youth staff years and years and years ago. But out of nowhere, he contacts me, and it's been probably, 10, maybe 12 years. And he said, hey, Bill, can we talk? This issue came up, and I said, yeah, absolutely. Typing back and forth. He said, I got diagnosed with a brain tumor. And he said, I think it's the same exact brain tumor your wife had. And so it was one of those sweet, neat times where I got to minister to him, where I got to, bring comfort and redirect him and his family, to lean into the church that they're at and to really trust God that He's going to get them through. And it was, like those moments where all of a sudden just the Holy Spirit is working in Facebook. Amazingly, He works, in Facebook. Sometimes the devil works in Facebook, but a lot of times Jesus works in Facebook. And I'm actually going to talk to him tomorrow. We have a call, kind of a conference call together, which I'm really, really excited about, just to pray over him and see how God is working in his life. But again, let me say, it was one of those things where at the beginning of the week, I said, God, I want you to use me, and so mess up my schedule, bring things in my way, let me just constantly be thinking about how you're moving. And so that's what God did. Just another quick story. And again, I'm making them sound good, but they're terrible stories. But they're good stories. Do you know how those work? And so I get a phone call, and it's this girl who used to be a woman, not a girl. She used to be in our marriage ministry years ago at a church called Crossroads, and we had this ministry called Fuse, and they were a huge part of that ministry. And during that time, I was ministering to her and her family because her son at that time was in high school, and he came out as homosexual. And so she was just like, what do I do? And I said, well, you love him, and you take care of him, and she's like, okay. And so eventually, he started coming to church. He gave his life to Jesus, and it was an awesome thing. But she'd call me, and this was, again, years later, so he's like 20-something now. He committed suicide. And she's just bawling, like, what did I do wrong? What's going on? What happened? And he had a history of depression, a history of things like that. And so, again, Jesus kind of opening up those doors and allowing me to be a part of the situation to bring hope and, to give, to show her love and to show her, hey, you're not a bad mom. Like, look at what you did do. And wisdom in how to approach her kids, and what is she going to tell her other kids? because he took his life. Is he going to heaven? Is he going to hell? And so we talked through all those things, and I got to spend an hour on the phone with her, just walking through each of those scenarios. And you know what? Yes, it was a terrible situation, but listen, that's the rich. That's the good stuff, right? Because when we allow God to use us, right, it begins to heal other families and things like that. Another one is I was in the office on Tuesday, and we were just about ready to go into a meeting. And I get this phone call, and my daughter, Mackenzie's frantic on the phone. She says, "Where's Watson?" Watson's our dog. Now, Watson isn't just a dog. Watson is a family member. How many of you have dogs that are family members, right? Yeah. In fact, we're going to have like a bring your dog to church day. I think it'd be awesome. We'll witness to the dogs. They can come to Jesus. We can baptize them. I don't know. But anyway, I love dogs. And so Watson is just this fluffy, loving, like, best friend that anybody ever had. And she came home and he was gone. Now, Watson never was left. And so we're freaking out. Well, as I go to get in my car, I said, "Guys, I got to bail on this meeting. I got to go find a dog because that's really important." I get in the car. I get a phone call. And it's this lady on the line. She says, "Hi, I have your dog." And I'm like, "Sweet." And she goes, "Yeah, can I keep him?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, where are you?" And so she goes, "Oh, I live on this street." And she goes, "I live right around the corner from you," because she called the license and got my name and address. And so it was like one of those neat times where, so I get in my car, go over to her house. Mackenzie's already over there. We grab the dog. We kind of start this conversation and come back home. A little bit later that day when I get off work, Mackenzie makes cookies, and Maddie and I walk over and kind of spend some time with their family and let the kids meet the dog. And they actually wanted a dog, and they were so bad they wanted to take one. They thought, well, here, like, God gave us a dog, like, that's, and so they ended up going to the shelter to get another. But anyway, it was this incredible story. And why I say that is, it was one of those little sweet things where you go, okay, this is really cool that these are neighbors we haven't met before. And so God used my crazy dumb dog, right? And she was driving in her minivan, and our dog was literally chasing her minivan down the street. So it was like God was like, "Okay, Watson, go chase the van because I want, I want your owners to go meet these people," right? And so God uses like dogs for his work. Really cool. I thought that's a cool story. You guys think that's a cool? Anyway, I thought it's a cool story. So. And I can go tell these stories all day, and then I won't even have a message to teach. Okay, one last one, and then this one's crazy. So we were at the Grove on Monday, because the kids had school off on Monday, and we were walking around, and they have like the farmer's market. Anybody ever been there? It's kind of a cool place, all the food. In fact, we tried to get frog legs. There's a little Cajun place in there. You can get frog legs, but then they're $14.99, so we didn't get frog legs. It's like a lot of money for frog legs. Like $2 I'd buy a frog leg, but 14. Anyway, so while we're here at the Grove, I'm on my cell phone, and I was having a conversation with a group of people, and we were just talking about some stuff, and I don't want to go into detail about what it was, but it was pretty a pretty important conversation, and we were talking through some issues and things like that as I was kind of with the family, and which is a terrible thing to do. Don't ever do that. That's a very bad example. Being on your phone when you're with your family. I'm sorry, I did that. And so anyway, we're talking, and this certain person's name came up within this text thing, and we were just talking about, oh man, I miss this person, and da-da-da-da-da. And then all of a sudden, I'm in the store, and I look up, and that person is right there. Right? And I don't know, and now I'm not going to end this. I'm going to kind of leave it, the tension of the story right there. Just say that it was, it needed to happen, and God just moved in an incredible way in that story. Because that's how God works, right? When we allow him and we step out, when we say, God, I want to live my life for you. I want to surrender what I want. I want to surrender how I live. All of a sudden, God's like, okay, then I'm going to start putting you in situations where I need you most. And so I hope and pray that we as a church would be a church that lives kind of in that tension, in that scariness, right? In that place. So just a little bit about what I shared last week. All right, so let me pray, and then we're going to jump in to this week, what we're going to talk about. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this morning and share all the good, great, incredible things you're doing and the baptisms that are going to happen. And God, I just want to pray for what we're going to talk about as well, that I know maybe some people in here just need to really hear this message, and they need to be set free. And Father, they're really struggling in some areas, and so I pray that they would find hope. And I pray, God, that you would do your work behind the scenes in their heart right now. In your name, amen. So we're going to talk about debt today. Isn't that great? We're going to talk about debts. Now let me ask you this question. Like in our world today, like if you rack up a bunch of debt, like what happens? Like you could go out right now, and some of you guys are like probably, if you have like an 800 credit score, you could get tons of credit cards, you could buy a house, you could buy all kinds of stuff, and then one day you lose your job. What happens to all that debt that you racked up, right? Well, really what happens is you have to pay it back, or you don't pay it back. And if you don't pay it back, what happens? Do you get thrown in prison? No. Do you get a bad credit score? Yeah. But really nothing really happens. I mean, obviously it's bad to have a bad credit score, and if you take some from somebody, you should pay them back. But in our world, when we have debt, the way we see debt is that, hey, you know what? Even if I can't pay this back, something will happen that I'm going to be okay. Like everything's going to be all right. I may be a little stressed. I may not be able to buy anything in the next 5 or 6 years because my credit score is so bad. But overall, I'll be okay. Well, in the time of Jesus, debt was a little different. If you went into debt and you couldn't pay for it, you're in big trouble. It's not like all of a sudden you can go hit bankruptcy or, you've got a bad credit score. What basically happens is whoever you owe the debt to owes you. They own you. Not owes you, they own you. And so let's say you can't pay off, you have a mortgage, and let's say you can't pay that off. The person who's carrying the mortgage says, well, you can't pay that off, so you're going to basically be my slave till you pay it off. And so you're going to work, and I'm going to dictate how much that work is worth, and when you're done paying off your debt, you might be set free. That's how debt worked in the first century. Now, that's quite a scary thing, right? And so when we look at debt, I want to kind of take our eyes off the 20th century view and kind of look at the first, like how do people back then? And so they viewed slavery much different. And it wasn't like, slavery recently is pretty bad. Back then, it was bad, but not near as bad. Mostly what would happen is if you became a slave, you kind of became part of the family, but not the family. You kind of were welcome to be a part of the family, but you weren't part of the family, if that makes sense. And so they treated slaves pretty well. It was more like a live-in job is really what it was like, okay? So you have to think of that. But everything you had, everything you did, they owned. And in fact, even if you got married while a slave, the slave owner would own your wife and your kids. So just kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, if you have debt, you have to pay that off, okay? And slaves were professionals too. They weren't just the poor people. They were doctors, they were people who were educated at times if they just ran it, if they had a business and it bailed and they couldn't pay off. So you have all kinds of people at all different going into debt and becoming slaves. So kind of picture that in your head. So in the New Testament, there was about a third of the population. Think about this. A third of the population who were some kind of slave. Okay? That's a lot of people, right? So a third of the population were owned by someone else. Okay, so just get that in your mind. And so this was common in Jesus' day. And so throughout the scriptures, throughout the Bible, there's all kinds of language that talks about slavery. And we sometimes skip over it. We don't understand it. We don't understand the terms and concepts of what they're getting at. And so turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 6 and look at this with me. Romans chapter 6. Look at verse 16. He says this. He says, don't you know that when you offer yourselves, I think we talked about this a couple months ago, but anyway, I'll bring it up again. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, okay? So basically, who you obey in your life is your master, right? It's talking about, again, slaves. Like, who I obey is my master. So there could be many different types of things that master my life. I'm going to talk about these in a second. And he says this. He says, whether you are slaves to sin, right? I could be a sin could be my master, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. Okay? So let me kind of dissect. It says we can kind of choose. We can live for ourselves, right? And that's kind of being a slave to sin. We can live for the world. We can live for ourselves, and that makes us a slave to sin. Or we could be a slave of righteousness and live for how God wants us to live and choose to live for Jesus, right? So we have these choices. Now, how do these pan out in our life? So I know for me, just lately, let me just be like kind of transparent with you, is about 3 months ago, maybe 4 months ago, man, I was doing really good. I started dieting. I started exercising. I started, being very disciplined in what I eat. I had this whole thing on my phone where I would, count, calories, and I wouldn't go over my calorie count. And I started losing weight, started feeling great. Everything was awesome. I was looking good. My wife's like, man, what's up? She's like, you're hot. And I'm like, yep, you know it. And so, sorry, Michelle. And then I got just some stress hit me. And when stress hits me, right, it just started from different, I started school, I'm in a master's program, I'm doing all kinds of other, and I'm like, okay, oh my gosh, all this stress starts to hit me. And so you know what happens when stress hits me? I eat. Oh, I eat. And I eat a lot. And so instead of eating for fuel, right, I'm eating for comfort. And there's a difference between that. And so I'm in, and I begin, those late night, I'm sneaking out of the house, going to, I'm going to Carl's Jr., a double Western bacon cheeseburger, large fry, and a Diet Coke, because I'm on a diet. Right? And right, because what's happening is the stress is getting to me, and instead of being a slave of righteousness, I'm becoming a slave of myself, right? I'm listening to what I think I need, and I'm following my own desires, and I'm filling them up. Now, again, this is a terrible illustration, but it really is, because you become obedient to, right? You become obedient to your master. And so when I'm stressed, my master becomes food. Wow. And I obey. Can't you tell? Right? I obey, and I listen to food, and what it tells me to do, I do it. And you know what? When it tells me, when I'm sitting at a restaurant, and I'm like, oh man, I got to get on the skinny menu, I'm over at the burger menu, with the, and I'm like the Western cheese, anything with barbecue sauce and fried stuff, I'm like, I'm in, right? And I know it's wrong, but I choose to listen to my master, and he masters me. And he controls me, and he makes, right? And so I do that as well. And do you see how it works? So we can choose, right? We can choose. And so I think what Paul's getting at here is that we're all slaves to something. And what is it that masters us? And we can be mastered by many different things, right, at different times. So what is it? And he's pushing us to be mastered by Jesus. Well, listen as it goes on. Verse 17 says, but thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves of sin, do you catch this? You have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. That's a whole sermon in itself. I'm not going to get there, but listen as it goes on here. Verse 18, we get back to some great slave language. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves of righteousness. You've become set free from sin. And it's funny because when we hear that, we go, yeah, man, set free. Like, do we really understand what that means? Like, you really, at the depths of who we are, do we understand what it means to be set free? And what is the context of when they heard this? How did they take? Because this is a power. It's like, oh yeah, I'm set free. Cool, set free. Yeah. But what does that mean? What is the depths of that? So let me give you a picture of this. Sin, right? Paul's saying this. Sin is something that controls us. It masters us. It tells us what to do, and it tells us when to do it. And in a way, we become indebted to our sin. And what I mean by this is, like, even with the food thing, right? The more you eat bad, the more you want bad. And it's this cyclical thing. It's a cycle. It continues. And it's hard to get out. If I'm in an addiction, right? And then all of a sudden, maybe I'm addicted to pornography, and so I know I should stop, but I just keep doing it, or alcohol, or whatever you want to use, or whatever, I'm addicted to pride, I'm addicted, and it never stops, and so there's always this debt that builds up. Does that make sense? A spiritual debt, because we're constantly in this place, right? And so that's how he's bringing that sin, that it masters us, it controls us, and we're powerless to free ourselves. We cannot say, okay, I no longer want to be a slave to this. I'm gonna think my way through it. I'm just gonna make it happen. How's that working for you? Right? And so we're powerless. And the reason we're powerless is because it provides us with what we want. It really does at the core, right? And let's be honest, let's get below the surface here. Like, yeah, I mean, hey, we all kind of look good in here. Some of you look good. But below the surface, there's a lot of sin in this room. There's a lot of darkness that you don't bring through these doors that maybe your kids don't even know about, or maybe they do know about. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on, right? And yet we still do it. And it's this cycle that happens. And we work hard, and at times, I got to pay off that debt. And the debt keeps stacking, and there's no way out. Well, in the ancient world then, how do you, if someone's in debt, and we're talking maybe even just physically here, how do they get free from that debt? How do they get released? And this is where I found fascinating when I was starting to study this. How does someone get free from this? And this is what they do. So someone has to come in and pay the price of this debt that you're in. And usually, at least when we talk about the Bible and how the Bible was written, and we talk about who the Bible was written to, that person would be a family member or a clan member or someone kind of in your tribe. So let's say someone saw me, and all of a sudden I couldn't pay my bills, and someone, I was under slavery over, and working for someone. My daughter Madison would go, hey, I'm going to work really hard to get my dad out of slavery. And so she would do everything she can to pay the debt, and she could go and help pay the debt so that I could get out of slavery. Okay, does that make sense? So that's kind of the picture. And what they would do is that person would buy back the sinner from the bondage of sin that they're in. Okay, now does this make sense? So think about this for a minute. There's just so many illustrations in here. They would buy back, and that person would be in bondage. You know what bondage means? Like something you can't get out of. And somebody from the outside has to come in and pull that person out of that bondage and buy them out, because that person in bondage cannot do it by himself. Okay? This is the picture. And so not only that, they would take on the responsibility of the debt. So that person would come in and say, okay, I'm going to pay for Bill's debt. Here's all the money. We raised it together. We're paying for the debt. Okay, so they pull you out of bondage. They pay for your debt. They stand up for your rights. Not only do they pay your debt, but you lose rights as a slave. And so there's some legality to this. They have to go and actually go before the judges and go before them and say, hey, we want to restore this person from being a slave into being not a slave. And so there's some legality there, and they bring it. They plead the cause before the officials and say, Bill was a great guy. He just made a couple of mistakes and and he got himself in trouble. Please let him go. And the person would take on the debt, and the slave would owe that debt again to the person freeing them. It's kind of interesting. It's not that the debt is gone. The debt changes hands from that person. Now, the person who was under bondage owes their clan or family member, right? They're still in debt. Does that make sense? So, this kept the person in the family, but still in debt. Do you know what that person's name is in the Bible in that time? You know what they called that person? They called him the Redeemer. They call him a Redeemer. So when we say Jesus is our Redeemer, do you get the picture? When they say Jesus the Redeemer, it's this, Jesus comes in and he pays that debt. And he says, no longer are you going to be under bondage. I'm going to pull you out of this life that you're in, and you're going to be with me. So this is what Paul's saying. You're no longer going to be a slave to your sin. You're going to be a slave. So you become a slave of righteousness. You're transferring into me, into living for me, right? That's the picture. But it even goes a little bit deeper. Listen to what it says here in John chapter 8. Hey, good job. You're already ahead of me. He says this. He says, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will... Oh, first service was way better. Let me try that again. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will... Right, the truth will set you free, right? It's slave language. He's saying this, listen. listen. You know that video? Anyway, go back. Okay, if you hold to my teaching, you really are my disciples. And if you're really my disciples, then you will know the truth, and that truth of being my disciples will set you free. Now go. And then it says this, and they answered him, and they said, well, we are Abraham's descendants, and we have never been slaves of anyone. Now, this is kind of funny because they were slaves for years. But what they were talking about is this idea of spiritual. We were never spiritually in bondage to anyone, right? And it says, well, how can you say that we shall be set free? And then Jesus replied, this is awesome. He says, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin, right? And then he says this, now a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So what he's saying is, I'm not only bringing you out, right? I'm not only bringing you out, I am actually saying that you are no longer a slave of mine, you are a son of mine. You are a son of mine. And he transitions us from being slaves to sons. He says, hey, I'm going to be your redeemer, but not only am I going to be your redeemer, but later in Romans chapter 8, he says, I'm going to be your Abba Father. I'm going to be and which means when he becomes our Father, that we, right, we become a part of God's family. We sang that song, Child of God. Incredible. We sang that song, Child of God, and that's what the picture is. Let me close with this story. This is one of my favorite stories. So I used to hear this in youth group when I was like 12, 13 years old. No, 14, 15 years old. And it was one of my favorite stories. And let me share it with you. There was once this little boy. And this little boy loved boats. And so as he began to think, he said, you know what, I want to build the greatest boat. And so he went to his dad and he said, Dad, can I go in the garage and just use whatever tools and whatever things you have and build this incredible boat? And his dad said yes. And so he goes and he grabs all his tools and he starts building, and he had all this incredible wood. And so for months and months and months, he'd work on this boat. And he had incredible detail. He put, all the little figures on it, and he made the boat perfect, and he put little sails and masts, and he painted every little thing. And he's like, man, this boat is amazing. I love what I did here. And he's like, I got to go try it out to see if this boat floats, to see if it actually works. And so he takes it down to the lake by where they live. And he puts the boat in the water, ties a little string to it, puts the mast up with the little sails, and the boat all of a sudden begins to sail across the little lake, and he's got his little string. A bunch of people started to come over and say, wow, where'd you get that boat? That's an amazing boat. He's like, yeah, I made it. And they're like, that's great. And all of a sudden, a big gust of wind came up, and as he was talking, he didn't have his hand tight enough on the string, and so when the wind blew, it filled the sails on the mast, and the boat took off, and he dropped the string, and the boat went across the lake. And it was a huge lake, and there was no way he could get his boat. And he was so sad, and he was so depressed because he lost his boat. About a month later, he's walking downtown in their little city where they lived, and he was walking by the secondhand store, and he looks in the window, and what does he see? He's like, oh my gosh, that's my boat. And his boat's sitting in the window at the secondhand store. And so he goes in and he runs in and he says, hey, that's my boat. I want my boat. Can I have my boat? And he goes to go grab it, and the guy who owns the store says, no, you can't have that boat. And he goes, well, it's my boat. And the guy's like, well, it was your boat, but now it's not my boat. And if you want the boat, it'll cost you $200. He's like, I don't have $200. He's like, oh, I'm sorry, then you're not going to get your boat. And he left. And for a minute he was sad, and then he said, you know what? I love that boat so much. I'm going to do everything I can to earn money to pay for that boat. And so he starts mowing lawns. He starts babysitting. He starts recycling cans. He does whatever he can, and month after month after month, he's raising all these dollars, 50 cents, till eventually he gets his $200, and he walks up to that store hoping his boat is still there, and it still is, and he walks in, and he goes up to the counter, puts all the money down. $200, I earned it all. Where's my boat? So the guy takes him over to his boat, he grabs it, and it's like this prized possession. And he takes it out, and he walks over, and he looks at it, and he says, little boat, you're twice mine. First I made you, then I bought you. Get it? God, I thank you for this morning. God, I pray and ask that we would understand that we've been bought with a price, and that in our response, Lord, that we live for you, that you've given us life, that if we choose to live for you, like we're going to see in these baptisms, where their lives have been transferred from slaves of sin to slaves of righteousness, I pray and I ask, Lord, that you do that in our lives. We pray this in your name. Amen.